Mrs. Gate and the Library of Whispers, and today I'm going to read the next part of this vintage book, all about the Great Fire of London in 1666. It's by W.G. Bell. Here's my bookmark. This is chapter 3, The Riverside Fire. The storm which kept apart the English and Dutch fleets prepared for the anxiously expected engagement in the Channel, and drove some of our sloops of war in a crippled condition into port, served London badly. A fresh breeze had blown for a week. It increased in violence on Sunday, and continued with little change during the worst days of the fire, shifting at times a point or two, but never more, and always driving the flames farther into the city. Landsmen, mystified in such matters, spoke of the wind as coming from all quarters. A sailor's knowledge here is valuable. Captain Joseph Ames, whose ship was weather-bound at Blackwall Reach, unable to get down the river, says that on the first day of the fire, the wind blew hard at east and north-east, and on the Thursday was still north-east. The city lay defenceless before the oncoming flames. Although warned by repeated fires, sometimes of considerable magnitude, the Lord Mayor and Aldermen had taken no effective steps to deal with the peril. Leathern buckets, ladders, axes, and strong iron fire-hooks were kept in each city church, usually under the tower, and at some of the livery companies' halls. Many references to their use and upkeep are found in the London church wardens' accounts of the 16th and early 17th centuries, but the provision came to be neglected. The augmentation of Peter Morris's original wheels at the bridge, largely increasing the quantity of Thames water raised, and more especially the introduction of new river water to London, had fostered a false sense of security, or at least condoned a deal of carelessness. Cocks were set up in the new river service pipes, where they entered each separate ward, to be used in case of fire in place of cutting the wooden pipes, which hitherto had been the practice on such occasions. But there was no system of street fire plugs. There had been invented by Horch of Nuremberg in 1651 an engine for throwing repeated jets of water, but such an appliance was wholly unknown in England at the time of the Great Fire of London. So here is a picture. This is a print of 1613 from the burning of Tiverton in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. cistern, commonly a large cask mounted on wheels. 3 of these ancient fire squirts are preserved at the Guildhall Museum. One had belonged to the ward of Aldgate in 1672, the second to the parish of St. Dionysus Backchurch, and the third was used at Guildhall in 1687. Each is a hollow cylinder, the barrel being 2 feet in length and provided with 2 side handles. The nozzle aperture is half an inch. The squirt was filled by inverting the nozzle in water, then reversed and, when in rapid use, held by 2 men, while a third operated a piston working within. So, over on this side you can see ancient fire syringes in the Guildhall Museum. The effective delivery was less than a gallon. With such rudimentary appliances and nothing better, the greatest fire ever experienced in this country was confronted. The Thames side above London Bridge, where the fire was now seated, was a rookery of stores and cellars, and low, dark dwellings, timber-built and rotting with age and neglect, with an occasional old merchant's house, fallen into decay and let out in tenements. A large part of the population which gained a living upon the river crowded into these hovels, wherry men, stevedores, porters, carriers and others. A church stood here, a livery company's hall there, and by these larger buildings a city is known, but 100-fold more numerous are the smaller unconsidered houses. They have neither history nor remembrance, but their existence must always be kept in mind if one shall understand the terrible calamity of the Great Fire, which ultimately destroyed 13,200 houses and left some 100,000 people homeless. Little of that picturesque old London which so fills the imagination was to be found by the waterside. There was but one continuous street, itself narrow and low-lying. Thames Street was raised 3 feet when London was rebuilt. Along it the whole of the merchandise brought by river had to pass. The way was commonly choked by carts, and the wheels rumbling on the cobblestones, and cries of the carters urging their straining horses up the steep brow of the hill into the city made the place pandemonium. On the level extending out to the river's edge, where devious alleys guided the pedestrians' footsteps to the Thames, every available inch of surface was covered by the squalid buildings, mostly weather-boarded and coated with pitch, and preserving no order or plan. The wall of the Roman city had run by Thames Street, where remains of it have recently been found near the bottom of Old Fish Street towards London Bridge, and it is probable that all this land between the street and the river had been recovered from the foreshore in lives to save, and here and there sick people carried away in beds. Extraordinary good goods in carts and on backs, and thus to the waterside. River full of lighters and boats taking goods, and good goods swimming in the water. The streets were full of nothing but people and horses and carts laden with goods, ready to run over one another, and removing goods from one burned house to another. The inexplicable nature of the fire, sweeping right and left, and the time of its occurrence, added to the flame and noise and commotion everywhere a vague dread of foreign attack, manifested in this tremendous fire, all the more fearful in men's minds, because no enemy was visible. The diarist makes many shrewd observations that reveal the unexpected actions of people in the distress of panic. Hardly one lighter, he notes, or boat in 3 that had the goods of a house in, but there was a pair of virginals in it. Why treasure the spinets when so much else was sacrificed? The city pigeons did not escape attention. Loath to leave the shelter of the houses, they hovered above windows and balconies till, with scorched wings, they fell down. From his boat on the river, Pepys had seen the flames pass the Old Swan, still marked by Old Swan Lane, and the boat pier, attack Dyer's Hall, and in an incredibly short time reach out to Cold Harbour and the Steel Yard. The Thames side, over the space of a quarter-mile, was then alight. The old hall of the Dyers' Company stood near the water, where now is Dyers' Hall Wharf, an ancient building already far advanced in decay, for the company in 1658 had contemplated taking it down and rebuilding. Little was left when the fire had spent itself. The hall, with the armour contained in it, and much of the plate being consumed, though some part of the plate was saved. Near by the Steel Yard was Waterman's Hall, fated, like the halls of the fishmongers and dyers, to complete destruction. The watermen, busiest of all people in saving the property of others, seem to have shown no practical concern in saving their own. The fire was the wherrymen's harvest time. Their boats were at every man's disposal, at rates rising to ruinous sums as the fire progressed. It is to be suspected that so actively engaged were they upon these unconscionable bargains that few boats were available when the home of their own guild was imperilled. No plate or pictures of the Watermen's Company survived the Great Fire of London. Of the accumulated mass of papers and records dealing with the affairs of the Thames, they have today only 3 books dating before the fire: a register of binding of apprentices, October 1655 to June 1665, a book of bylaws and orders from 1626 to 1662, and a volume containing Privy Council orders. The rest were black carbon. Of all the buildings there stood intact after the fire nothing save the stone gateway giving access to the Thames. The hall faced the river and had belonged in 1600 to Earl Gilbert, who destroyed the western part of the ancient building. What remained was in use by the Waterman's Company in 1647, and probably many years before, though no date is known. was entered from Thames Street by a passage at the side of All Hallows, the Less. That church was itself completely destroyed, and the site is marked today by its fragment of God's Acre. The lodge at All Hallows, the Mall, stood but a few paces distant, an important church with 3 aisles and tower, and chapels of St. Catherine and St. Barbara and Lady Chapel. This had been one of the first London churches to set up the King's Arms on its walls in 1660, when Monk and Montague, plotting the restoration, were yet undecided. It was so shattered by the intense heat that part of the roofless shell was afterwards blown down by wind. The end of the fabric had to be pulled down to avoid peril of life. The steeple stood firm, and from the molten bell, metal recovered from the rubbish that strewed the floor, a new bell was cast and hung in the belfry in the year 1670. All Hallows, the Moor, had a cloister towards the river already, foully defaced and ruinated. In Stowe's time it walks surrounded by a graveyard. The possession of a cloister so entirely unexpected in a London parish church led Sir Walter Besant to suppose there may have been some sisterhood of nuns attached to the church to offer prayers for the safety of travellers crossing by the ferry, and a later writer, Mr. J. Taverner Perry, has suggested as a more plausible theory that the cloister and the enclosing burial ground belonged to the Hanse merchants of the neighbouring steel yard, and had been formed by them as the Campo Santo in a foreign land. It has been treated as unique, which it was not, for there were cloisters of various other city churches. What the term implies is not clear, but these structures seem rather to have been covered ways from the street to the church door than to have followed the well-known plan of the monastic cloister. More significant of the fate threatening London was the appearance of fire on Lawrence Pountney Hill. The circumstances were dramatic. Till then, the fire had raged only along the Thames side, with an arm thrust out upon the bridge, and an ugly nucleus of fire about Fish Street Hill and the bridge foot. St. Lawrence Pountney Church, raised upon an eminence, overlooked the burning quarter by the river, as its slender tapering spire, one of the tallest in London, overlooked the whole city. Pepys saw the steeple take fire in the very top, and there burned till it fell down. Live brands lodged by the wind had melted the lead casing and ignited the timber beneath. To another and more imaginative onlooker, the fire atop of the steeple discovered itself with so much terror, as if taking a view from that lofty place of what it intended suddenly to devour. The apparition to a third spectator disclosed a deep design. I saw the fire, Thomas Middleton, a surgeon, told the Parliamentary Committee, break out from the inside of Lawrence Pountney steeple, when there was no fire near it. These and names since that of Pountney's Inn, from successive noble owners. The Dukes of Exeter and Suffolk had lived there. Then came Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, and afterwards Henry Courtenay, Earl of Devon, and the Earls of Sussex. It was in Buckingham's brief day known as the Manor of the Rose, and is so referred to by Shakespeare in King Henry VIII, Act 1, Scene 2, wherein the Duke's surveyor discloses Buckingham's traitorous conversation. Not long before your Highness sped to France, the Duke being at the Rose, within the parish, St. Lawrence, Pountney, did of me demand what was the speech among the Londoners concerning the French journey. The Merchant Taylors' Company had acquired the larger part of the property by purchase from the Earl of Sussex. In 1561, and in the buildings established, their famous grammar school, it was completely burned out. John Goad, the schoolmaster, at personal risk saved a portion of the library, and 18 months later collected some of his scholars in a parish room by St. Andrew under Shaft, as the new school buildings rose slowly. Hector Ford, the head usher, taught in the vestry house of St. Catherine, Cree, which escaped the fire, undertaking to provide a partition to prevent the boys running about the church. The city was all astir. Hasty summons had gone out to assemble the trained bands. They tramped to the fire under command of their officers, and were posted at their several stations, watching at every quarter, says Vincent, for outlandish men, because of the general fears and jealousies, and rumours that fireballs were thrown into the houses by several of them, to help on and provoke the too furious flames. The king sent in his guards. The Duke of York bade Pepys tell the Lord Mayor that he should have more soldiers he might require, and so, adds the diarist, did my Lord Arlington afterwards, as a great secret. A spectator found a party of 40 horse of the Life Guards drawn up in Cornhill, and touring around the edge of the fire, met some companies of the king's regiments and of the trained bands marching into the city. In Cannon Street his further progress was stopped by the obstruction of goods and carts with which it was filled. Here, he adds, we met my Lord Mayor on horseback, with a few attendants, looking like one frightened out of his wits. In Cannon Street, not yet reached by the fire, Pepys first met the Lord Mayor when he returned from Whitehall with the king's orders. His account of that bewildered official is not more flattering. At last met my Lord Mayor in Canning Street like a man spent, with a handkerchief about his neck. To the king's message he cried, like a fainting woman, Lord, what can I do? I am spent. People will not obey me. I have been pulling down houses, but the fire overtakes us. Faster than we can do it. That he needed no more soldiers, and that for himself he must go and refresh himself, having been up all night. So he left me, and I him, and walked home, seeing tracks away from the flames into Cannon Street, believing that safety lay there. The street ran on the ridge of the hill. In the afternoon, the gods were again moved out. When the peril came near into Lombard Street and farther, says Pepys, and among others I saw my little goldsmith Stokes receiving some friend's goods, whose house itself was burned the day after. The King and the Duke of York came down the river from Whitehall in the afternoon, rode in the royal barge, and Pepys attended them to Queenhithe. Legend tells that His Majesty watched Waterman's Hall, still burning from a tall house roof in one of the alleys by the Three Cranes in Vintry, and was so stirred by the sight, and so eager in giving directions for more houses to be pulled down in advance of the flames, that his own life was in some jeopardy. But little was or could be done, says Pepys, the fire coming upon them so fast. Good hopes there was of stopping it at the Three Cranes, above and at Botolph's Wharf, below bridge, if Kirby used, but the wind carries it into the city, so as we know, not by the waterside, what it do there. The Earl of Craven was one of a small band of noblemen who rendered London conspicuous service during the fire. William Lindsay Lord Craven, after long exile on the continent, had followed Charles II to England at the Restoration. He had remained at his house in Drury Lane when the court fled to Oxford on the outbreak of the plague, and with Monk and Dean Sancroft, who also stayed, tended to the wants of the poor and the afflicted. In the stricken city, his splendid activities and self-sacrificing work at great personal risk had won for him the affection of the citizens. It was no doubt at the burning of London that Lord Craven first acquired a passion for helping in the extinction of fires, which survived till near the end of his long life. There is a well-known anecdote that his horse knew the smell of a fire at a great distance, and was accustomed immediately to gallop off with him to the spot. whispers.